Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome back to my channel, Think Big, Learn Smart. So the topic of our today's discussion is disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation regime. So without further ado, let's start the discussion. So we will be discussing the concept, history, and reasons for disarmament. Let's start. First of all, before understanding about the non-proliferation and disarmament regime, we have to understand the concept of disarmament and non-proliferation. What does disarmament means and what does non-proliferation means? So in this slide we will discuss the concept of disarmament. Disarmament means total elimination of weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear, biological and chemical weapons. So how can disarmament eliminate those weapons of mass destruction? Through the prohibition on development, production and use, as well as destruction of all such weapons. So that is what disarmament means. It is the act of putting down weaponry, especially the decline and removal of military weapons. That is the concept of disarmament. What is non-proliferation? Non-proliferation is prevention of the spread of weapons of mass destruction and their means of delivery. So it is a preventive concept. It is a preventive measure. What are the types of nuclear proliferation? There are two types: horizontal proliferation and vertical proliferation. So what does horizontal proliferation means? It is the spread of weapons to the states that are not possessing nuclear weapons already, and vertical proliferation means increasing the destructive power of nuclear weapons. That is vertical proliferation. It is mostly applicable to the nuclear weapons because biological and chemical weapons are banned in any kind of war, and they were banned in biological weapons were banned in 1973 under the Biological Weapons Convention of the United Nations. Chemical weapons were banned in 1993 under the Chemical Weapons Convention of the United Nations. What is the history of disarmament? What have been happening in the disarmament efforts throughout the history? I have listed the most important events in the chronological order. So disarmament history can be traced back to the Treaty of Westphalia that happened in 1648, which stipulated against building fortifications. Fortifications are basically walls that are built around a particular state to protect it from the attack of the enemy. So in the Treaty of Westphalia, it was stipulated against building fortifications. And as we know, Treaty of Westphalia is also famous for giving the concept of nation state that we discussed in the previous video. Then another major event in the disarmament happened. It was in 1816 when the Tsar of Russia calls for arms reduction to the British government, which was not received well by the British government. Then again efforts happened in 1863 and in 1869. France calls for disarmament in Europe, but also not received well. Then in 1891, first step towards the disarmament happened, and it was first Hague Peace Conference initiated by the Tsar of Russia and called European power to discuss disarmament. So what was the Hague Peace Conference? It was a series of international treaties and declarations negotiated at two international conferences. First Hague Peace Conference and the second Hague Peace Conference that happened in Netherlands, Hague. And in this conference it was talked about the laws of war and war crimes in the body of secular international law. And third conference was also planned that would have happened in 1914, but it didn't took place. Second happened in 1907. Then in 1926, after the First World War, Council of League set up Commission for Disarmament, which failed. So after the First World War, a League of Nations was formed on the suggestion of the US President Woodrow Wilson. Then the League of Nations formed Council of League for the Disarmament, which set up the Commission for Disarmament, which failed and its efforts were in vain. Then after the Second World War and nuclear devastation, UN came in and laid much emphasis on disarmament. So what happened in the Second World War? The United States of America dropped two nuclear bombs on Japan's two cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Then UN came in and it emphasizes on the disarmament, because there was the huge destruction happened in these two events. Then in 1953, Atoms for Peace plan came. What was Atoms for Peace plan? It was a speech delivered by the US President Eisenhower. The idea came from that, and US launched this program, supplied equipment, information to schools, hospitals and research institutions within US and throughout the world. 3 nuclear reactors were formed in Iran, Israel and Pakistan. So the basic idea for this was to give the nuclear technology to those states so they can utilize its energy for peaceful purposes, for energy creation. Then NPT came, Non Proliferation Treaty, in 1968. It was a multilateral treaty for the goal of disarmament. Its main objective was to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and weapons technology. Opened for signature in 1968, enforced in 1970, and treaty also established a safeguard mechanism under responsibility of the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency. Then the SALT talks happened between USA and USSR. SALT 1, 1972. SALT is the abbreviation of Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. It was bilateral talks on the arms reductions between US and USSR, setting up a particular aggregate on strategic offensive weapons systems and imposing qualitative restraints on existing and future strategic systems. That was SALT 1. Then SALT 2 came in 1980s. So these talks happened from 1972 to 1980 but failed to materialize because there were some misunderstanding between USA and USSR. Then came Ctbt, Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, in 1996. Before Ctbt, PTBT also came, Partial Test Ban Treaty, in 1963, but it was failed to materialize because of other states. So it was a multilateral treaty that bans all nuclear explosions for both civilian and military purposes in all environments. It was adopted by United Nations General Assembly in September 1996, but came not into force as 8 specific nations have failed to ratify the treaty. Then some other notable efforts happened in 2003 by European Union, which adopted strategy against proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Then in 2004, the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, initiated multilateral approaches to the nuclear fuel cycle. So that was the history of disarmament and the efforts that happened in the world for decreasing the nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction. So why disarmament is important? Arms and arms race are very costly and potentially very bloody. They are very costly because they are very resource needing. There are huge resources required for building nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction, and potentially very bloody. They can wipe out the whole humanity. Arms reduction can curtail defense burden and allow economic investment for productive purposes. So there are huge amounts of money used for building those weapons. So if any state can curtail that burden, they can invest that money in the economic purposes and the country can get a huge economic boost in its economy. Unchecked growth of armaments without economic means can lead to internal repression and external aggression. So if any state is building nuclear weapons or any other weapons of mass destruction, they are using huge resources of their economy, and if they are building a lot of those weapons, they are basically making their own state unstable, making it internal repressive and external aggressive. Weapons of mass destruction present a unique existential threat to all humanity that I emphasized on the very first point. The rise of terrorism, that is a global issue that is happening in our today's era, with the danger that nuclear weapons might be acquired by terrorists, greatly increases the danger they will be used for that purpose. So their proliferation can be very dangerous for the whole humanity. So that was all in my presentation. Thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.